Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Peter Shih from uTest. As Erickson mentioned, it's great to be back at MODEV. Undoubtedly, we had a very good time back in December. I'll be, aside from making up 10 minutes from Josh, I'll be also talking about why great user experience matters much more so today than ever before. So let's go ahead and chug along. We are at, I have one. We are at a mobile usability conference, so chances are that I don't need to convince you that mobile is huge. But just in case there are any holdouts, let's run through a couple of stats first. So if you look at some of the forecasted numbers, the figures are astonishing. Right? The market research firm IDC projects that mobile app revenues will hit $35 billion by 2014, and this is only the revenue that incurs from downloading and purchasing of apps. There's another research firm called ABI Research, and they project $133 billion, and this is for the mobile enterprise service sector alone. So no matter how you slice and dice the figures, I mean, the numbers are just humongous. However, the market is not just big, it's also very diverse. From B2B, from B2C, spanning different industries and sectors and markets. What you see here is that the interesting point here is that many of these applications actually began as outsourced projects. So a couple years ago, you guys might have had a very simple application for a point solution. Well, today, last year, and going forward, a lot of these projects are coming back in-house. They're becoming much more strategic, and they're also becoming mission critical for you. So Josh alluded to this earlier too, and we established that the market is big and diverse. But in fact, we are only in the early phases of this mobile boom. Baseball fans, we're in the third inning. If you are a golf fan, we're still in the back nine, way in the back nine. So in other words, it's easy to think that we're peaking, we're already here in the mobile world. But the truth of the matter is that we're just at the tip of the iceberg. One very critical point, a crucial inflection point, if you look at 2011, is that for the first time ever, smartphones actually outsold laptops and desktops combined. That's a huge feat. It's also projected that by 2015, tablets alone will also outsell laptops and desktops combined. Now, we look at the market, you look at the growth, but there's also an interesting note about the increasing rates of adoption. AOL, if you guys still remember that brand from way back when. It's still around. They're transforming. Are there anybody here from AOL? So, how many years did it take AOL to reach 1 million subscribers? Take a guess. How many years? Someone said 9 years? 9 years. Facebook, how many months did it take Facebook to reach 1 million subscribers? 9 months. And are you guys familiar with Draw Something? You guys use it all the time? It took them 9 days to get to 1 million. Phenomenal. So now that we've established the size, the growth, the importance of the mobile usability market, let's dive right into some of the challenges that we face today. So we can begin by looking at the obvious, right? A lot of you have mobile web, a lot of you have native apps, a lot of you have one of the two, and some of you guys have both, if not more, options. And there are cons and pros to both, and each brings about different and unique challenges. If you look at the single versus multiple platform approach, it's very true that mobile web is in fact simpler. It's one code base, one release schedule, one testing methodology, if you will, versus multiple platforms. With that said, it's true as of last year, and maybe a little bit this year, that the native app experience is still a little bit more controlled. You can enable rich media functionality. There's a lot of code that you bring in to your physical device that you might not get on mobile web. In addition to that, you also have App Store, the distribution and ratings. That's something that you don't get for mobile web. So these are all the pros and cons that you get for a mobile web versus native app. And increasingly, a lot of our customers don't select an either or. It has to be a both solution. In addition, another big challenge for us today is that there are multiple input-output mechanisms. Right? Gone are the days of simple mouse, monitor, keyboard. Those were the good old days. Now we have touchscreens that enable us to do pinch, zoom, rotate all at the same time. Swipe, tap, click, you name it. There's so many other gestures that have yet to even come into fruition today. And increasingly, we have voice controls too, right? Nuance Communications, Lingo, these are all different solutions that bring a whole different way in which we communicate and interact with our software. And the point is that all this needs to work seamlessly with the integrated solutions that we have today with a keyboard, if you will, with hard buttons, along with touchscreen. In addition to all that, I would also say that functional issues really matter much more so today than ever before, and especially on mobile devices. A simple loading issue or rendering issue could easily cramp or cripple your user experience on a mobile device. Additional challenges, we mentioned this before, but it feels like we're back to the future. We're playing a lot of the games that we did back in the late 90s for web. For the first time in a decade, form factors matter again. Are you using a feature phone, smartphone, tablets, you name it. In addition to that, if you look at the world of standards, is largely non-existent today. Although there are many areas and facets that are getting better every single week, every single month. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of, the landscape is extremely fluid. You have OS, browser considerations. You have handset manufacturers and models. You have wireless carriers that actually play into effect how your app performs from one wireless carrier to another, regardless of the same make, model, and even operating system. The real kicker here for mobile, though, is location. Your app, does it work well inside your lab? Well, let's try that going up 95 in DC. Let's try that, swapping out SIM cards in Europe or roaming in Canada. Does it work the same as it does inside your QA lab? And that's ultimately a big question. So let's take a step back. We talked about the challenges that we face today, but a lot of us are building apps not just for today, but also for the future. So let's take a step back and imagine what's out on the horizon. So based on a purely gut feel and a couple of rough data and rough trend analysis, you can argue that the world of mobile OS is dwindling, and that's probably a good thing for us. At uTest, we're seeing a lot of our customers go from 5 supporting platforms down to 4, down to 3. You have to have an iOS app. You have to have that. You should probably have an Android app as well if you want to reach a different target audience. BlackBerry, Windows, we still have yet to see how that plays out. And Symbian, are there any Symbian users in the room still? Don't be embarrassed. I still use a BlackBerry. It's okay. But likely we'll see in the next year or even sooner that this market will continue to dwindle. Another one is that HTML5 could very well mean that mobile web will trump native app. That's an area that we see more and more of, and that is an increasing trend. A lot of our customers are not only testing native app, but they're building a mobile web that's much more robust across platforms, across even form factors like tablets. And finally, you guys might have heard of a lot of this trend in hybrid wrappers or hybrid apps. And essentially, these are downloadable apps that have a unique front end based on different OSs. But they do have the shared backend data, content, functionality. And a lot of that is using the user interface that's embedded with your browser. So I'm sure if you walk around this room, you ask your neighbor on your left and your right, many of us have a lot of different predictions. And some of them are going to be true, some of them are going to be false. But ultimately, the question from me to you is, are you willing to bet all of your investment dollars on that one single outcome? Right? It's a very, very gutsy move. And with our customers, we're seeing a lot of them are hedging their bets, and they're increasingly building out a very robust app portfolio. I do hesitate a little bit at this slide, and that's because I don't want to blow the problem out of proportion. But we do tend to think of smartphones and tablets as a very, very challenging dilemma, and it is. Multiple platforms, multiple release schedules, multiple testing, wireless carriers cover, so on and so forth. But imagine a whole new world of extended platforms that we can build apps upon. And Josh alluded to this earlier. Already we're seeing customers build apps on Kindle Fires and Barnes & Noble Nooks. If you were at CES this past year, you know that connected TVs are supposedly the next new fad. Moving on, we have gaming consoles. Increasingly, Xbox and PlayStations, you can build apps upon those as well. But what about cars? And last but not least, household appliances, right? Refrigerators have built-in tablets and devices that you can access your apps now, weathers and recipes and so on and so forth. And finally, I mean, building out a smart home, building out a smart city, building out a smart nation. I mean, this is the way that the world is moving. And increasingly, as UX designers and architects, we need to have this in mind. So at this point in the conversation, I'm frustrated. You might be frustrated. All this is very, very daunting. And I mentioned before that this is daunting for product owners. It's daunting for developers. It's daunting for marketers. But I personally believe that is none more so daunting than those that are designing the front-end user experience. And so there are definitely approaches that we can benefit from. And I want to walk us through a couple. There are various ways that you can segment the different approaches. And some of these are very, very familiar to you if you look back into the late 90s web. We begin with on-site versus remote. And for obvious reasons, the on-site option is the most controlled, most sterile environment. But increasingly, we're finding that remote option is becoming much more popular, and that's not even for cost reasons alone. How many of you are familiar with the Hawthorne effect, or the observer effect, or the Big Brother effect? So we all know that if you're observing your user a little bit too carefully, that does change the way they interact with their software, the way they give you feedback in their software as well. Now with remote, what the benefit is that you get to meet your users in their own environments, in their own scenarios, in their own comfort level, as opposed to a sterile environment. Next we have moderated versus unmoderated. Now my question for you is, do you follow this approach? Do you ask leading questions to them? Or do you perhaps probe them and have them run through the maze themselves? And finally, we have survey versus recorded. How are you soliciting a response from them? Are they filling out a survey? Are you monitoring their interaction with their software? Are you even recording their eye tracking and audio narrations? This one's a little bit of a blur, and there's a lot of, it's not mutually exclusive from the past, but, are you using explicit methods or implicit methods, right? Are you observing how your users interact with their software? Where do they get stuck? How many false paths do they take before they reach their intended consequence? So regardless of which approach you take, and I'm sure you'll be taking multiple approaches, here are a couple of considerations that you should be taking, and some of them are very familiar tactics and tools that still apply as they did back in the late 90s with web. The first one is, consider sitemaps, wireframing, prototyping, whether it's paper versus digital. All these still apply, and we're not throwing them away just because we're in the mobile era. The one thing I will mention is that the testing, the prototyping, this no longer happens only pre-launch anymore. This happens post-launch because, gone are the days of 6-month waterfalls. If you're doing a post-launch today, you're actually doing a pre-launch for your next phase already. The next one is that, native app is still the beast of 2011, but consider that the tide may be shifting soon. Something that I heard back last year at CTIA was that you want to forget about making the mobile web and consider making the web mobile. And a lot of the points are similar to what Josh mentioned before, and that is, you look at this embarrassing site right here, and this is from probably a couple years ago, and I purposefully made it a little bit blurry so I don't incriminate anybody. But if you're on this site, your user experience sucks. I mean, to put it blatantly. It might work great on your desktop, but as Josh mentioned already before, there might be a lot of irrelevant content. You might be cluttering the end user. It's hard to find what that person's looking for. And so the point here is that you want to simplify your experience. You want definitely clarity of content. But here's something that is a little bit subjective, a little bit controversial, but you want to consider, and I use that word consider very heavily, because you want to consider providing a link from mobile web to your desktop web and vice versa. And again, this is all based on where you are. It could be transitional, but it could be a great stepping stone for you to make your web a lot more mobile and user-friendly. All right, so we talked a lot about the range of approaches and other considerations. Why don't we focus our attention for a couple minutes on the various offerings and services that you might be familiar with, and some of you might say, hey, these are good places for me to start. So I have a couple of graphs here, and they're very simple, but I want to walk you through various axes that we can evaluate existing services against. In this slide, you have the approach of do-it-yourself or self-serve versus white glove, more expert options. And you can see in the lower left-hand corner, there's a clutter of tools that you can use that are largely do-it-yourself. Are you guys mostly familiar with these tools? A couple of people. The point here is that you can definitely have a quick and dirty approach if you want to, assuming that you guys have a lot of mobile usability experts in-house. On the other hand, you have a lot of white glove service that you can do that are also very expensive. And just to give you an idea of the scope and the cost of all these different options, on the far upper right-hand side, you can see Usability Labs. Some of you might be familiar with Bentley Labs in Boston, as well as Usability Sciences in the Austin area. So these guys are on-site resources with very, very much white glove service. They might cost you $100,000, and we're talking about a span of 12 to 15 weeks before you get your results. So very, very much, very expensive and very time exhaustive as well. In the middle, and not to promote uTest too much, but uTest provides 10 days turnaround and roughly $5,000. And in the lower left-hand corner, you might find options that run you 30 minutes, costing you about $300. So you can see the very wide range of options that are at your disposal. Moving on to remote versus on-site, you can see that the map is a little bit more cluttered. I mentioned before that remote is becoming an increasingly popular option. With that said, you might even have tools that you guys already have purchased. I circle here, Cisco WebEx or even GoToMeeting or LogMeIn. These are all tools that if you're already using today, they could easily augment your usability or user experience studies. And we also have moderated versus unmoderated. You can see here that the unmoderated approach is very popular, but coupled with online coordination and narration, you can do recording and eye tracking as well. And finally, I'll mention a couple words about explicit versus implicit. The one thing that's very interesting here is that if you look at the upper right-hand corner, some of these tools might not be familiar to you. And a lot of these tools are actually originally intended to do load and performance testing. So they do a lot of heat maps, they can do a lot of path analysis. But with that said, this could be a very good way for you to utilize implicit approaches to find out where your users are going and what paths and where they're stumbling with your application. So putting all the offerings and solutions aside for a second, there are some very specific mobile usability considerations. One thing that I'll always tell people is that you must begin with the end user in mind. The other thing is that, especially for mobile today, if you look at location dependency, geo-awareness, carriers, you need to be utilizing respondents that actually match your end user base. In other words, people inside your lab, inside your company, you might have 3 or 4 people that are very, very good, but at the end of the day, they only live in one location. Are they where your users live, work, and play? Well, likely not. So what we tend to do is ask people to match their respondents with end user base, and that involves technologically, geographically, and also demographically. And finally, test with real live devices that are in the wild. We mentioned before that there's a whole wide range of combination or permutations of all 4 of these criteria. And so there's an increasing need for you to step outside of your lab and into the wild. So we wrap up here, and I want to just have a couple of 2 more slides with you and talk about the bottom line. The bottom line is that every situation is different. Every company, every product, every market, every space. But here are a couple of recommendations. Determine what your mobile testing playbook looks like for you. What matters to you? Is on-site more important than remote? Is moderated more important than unmoderated? So on and so forth. And many, many times you'll be combining different approaches here as well. Second, there are various desired deliverables for you, but ultimately we need to determine which ones are going to be providing you the most actionable approaches. So if you have a recorded session, is that going to tell you everything you need to know about what the end user has experienced? And will you be able to deduce what you need to change with your user experience? And finally, how do I get there? And traditionally there are 3 approaches. You can either buy a product, buy a service. You can build, and you can also partner. And in addition to that, a lot of the analysis will be determined by how much expertise you already have in-house. Some of you are 2-3 person shops versus how much capacity and expertise you really need. And so finally, the last slide, some of the key takeaways for this presentation. First of all, mobile has forever changed the landscape of usability. It's no longer sufficient to design an app for one site anymore. And due to the fluid nature, right, of the mobile landscape, there's an increasing need for you to test your software, not only inside the lab, which is very critical and very important, but to also step outside the lab to complement your in-the-lab testing with what we call in-the-wild testing. The second key takeaway is that you need to test often, you need to listen to your end users, and you need to iterate often. And some of that includes the familiar tactics and tools that you already use today. And finally, I would say leave a lot of the heavy lifting to the UX expert. At uTest, we utilize a lot of our experts that are PhDs or higher in terms of usability, architecture experience, human factors engineering. Leave a lot of the heavy lifting to them, but just as importantly, find and select respondents that match your end user base. And so if I could close, I would say that at the end of the day, the products that win, the brands, the companies, the teams that succeed ultimately are those that continue to work with their in-house testing, right, in the lab. But they furthermore and beyond that, they actually work with more progressive measures and take their testing from in-house and augment that with what is called in-the-wild testing. So with that, thank you guys for your time.